Why weren't slaves allowed to be educated? I know we know, like, here in the U.S., there were anti-literacy laws, but the reality is that even in places like Brazil, enslaved people were legally not allowed to be educated. There were laws. The state put resources behind making sure that enslaved people could not access knowledge, could not access education, could not build the skills to acquire that knowledge themselves. And it makes you wonder, why is being enslaved so incompatible with being educated, with having the skills and tools to acquire knowledge? Why are these two things so incompatible? What is it about having knowledge and the skills to acquire knowledge that inhibit one's ability to be enslaved, that inhibit the ability of others to control and direct your autonomy and your labor? Why are these two things so diametrically opposed to each other? And if there was a global shift in how folks perceived and talked about slavery, such that slavery itself fell out of fashion, at least in the ways we were historically accustomed to, but there were people who wanted to maintain the control, perhaps now, instead of prohibiting education, you'd just muddle it, right? You'd fill classrooms and textbooks and curriculum with knowledge that isn't actually empowering or useful. Maybe, hypothetically, you'd fill classrooms with patriotic propaganda, with rote memorization and facts that, although a form of knowledge, not necessarily helpful in helping you craft a life on your own terms, that allows you to thrive without people being able to direct your labor and bodily autonomy. Perhaps instead what you'd fill your classrooms with, since you had to give folks access to classrooms because inhibiting education or prohibiting education is a slavery, is so heavily associated with slavery. Instead, you wouldn't be able to do that. So instead, what you'd do is you'd craft textbooks and curriculums and educational institutions that did not actually help people improve their material condition. You'd control what was allowed in the classroom, what was allowed to be taught. You'd demonize certain kinds of education, the kind that is most likely to interfere with control and manipulation. And then, hypothetically, this group of people might find some other medium in the wake of the internet. With the advent of social media platforms, they'd get on and they'd hear from all kinds of people with all kinds of backgrounds and expertise. And they'd be exposed to learning and education that actually empowered them and made them realize that the education that they went through in K through 12 and some of even their college education, although they weren't prohibited from accessing it, it didn't actually fill them with knowledge that was useful. And in fact, a lot of the knowledge that they got wasn't even accurate, was propaganda, or intentionally omitted so many facts as to make the knowledge they had access to fairly useless. And they'd realize that they did not get access to education that helped them, for example, be self-sufficient. They weren't taught to grow their own food. They weren't taught to build their own shelters or make their own clothes. They were taught to be on time. They were taught to follow instructions. They were taught to fall in line, literally to get in line, right? They were taught skills that would still make their labor useful to people who wanted to control them. And once those people got whiff that, once the people who wanted to control got whiff that the masses were accessing information on this platform and were realizing that a lot of their education had been manipulated to inhibit their own autonomy, that their education had been manipulated, they were giving access intentionally to education that was not useful or would not serve them or optimize their ability to thrive on their own terms. Once the people who were interested in controlling the masses realized that, perhaps they would introduce bills and try to pass laws to ban such an app. You know, hypothetically.